Could Russia attack NATO within just a few weeks? Well, the United States now seems to think so. Details of new intelligence reports have been outlined in this article by the Wall Street Journal. It says Russia's President Vladimir Putin could test NATO's resolve with a limited incursion on an allied country. And that could happen as soon as this fall. That is next month. Now, the key quote from that article sets out how U.S. intelligence thinks Russia could strike. It says the possible threats range from a cyber attack on a NATO country or sending unmarked armed groups to occupy territory to a limited incursion on the alliance's eastern flank. The time frame for any move by Russia is estimated to happen between this fall and the year 2029. That's according to the U.S. intelligence assessments. So are those U.S. assessments right? And just how might the U.S. respond if Russia does decide to mount an assault on NATO very soon, especially with America's hands full in the Middle East and new reports of rapidly depleting stockpiles of U.S. missiles? Also to think about, what could an attack look like? Could Russia already be sending warning signals? Consider this, the discovery of a drone carrying explosives at Leipzig airport this week. Now, not yet directly linked to Moscow by authorities, but an incident that Germany's interior minister said was being treated as part of a professional hybrid threat scenario, marking what he called, quote, a new level of danger for Germany. Russia's Berlin embassy has dismissed any involvement, calling it, quote, a contrived provocation. And in the last few weeks, more warnings of the growing Russian threat on NATO's eastern flank, which includes Poland and the Baltic states.
We are talking about a limited-scale, yet targeted, kinetic strike operation that is very likely to be directed at critical infrastructure facilities. These could simply be various types of strike measure aimed at physically damaging critical infrastructure.
Putin has a hard time selling his war activities to the society because they're all being hurt daily. Their business, their travels, their commuting, their day of life has changed. There's 45% effect on the gas, petrol, diesel availability. Thus, people are asking questions. Thus, he needs a quick win. So potential hybrid threat is more likely than it was before. So it's purely calculating what had happened.
I would like to assure you that the Lithuanian intelligence is working, that we are gathering information and can see that Russia is considering possible provocations in the Baltic region and that Russia is considering the possible use of false flag operations.
Well, to unpack this latest report, I'm joined now by Daniel Hamilton. He's a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins SAIS Foreign Policy Institute and a fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. He has held numerous positions in the U.S. Department of State and spent decades analyzing transatlantic security, NATO strategy, European geopolitics, and the future of the U.S.-Europe relationship. Daniel, it's good to have you with us. I'm sure you've seen this report by the Wall Street Journal.
Yes.
It claims that U.S. intelligence now sees Vladimir Putin launching a limited attack of some type on a NATO country as soon as this fall. I mean, that is next month. What did you think when you read this?
Well, I think the thinking has been since Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022 that to go after NATO as well would be like overstretch. And I think the thinking had been since then, Putin has his hands full with Ukraine, so why would he also try to extend it to NATO? But, things are changing for Russia. The war is not going very well. There's lots of attrition. There's grumbling back home. And the idea that you could divide the alliance and distract it might be something now that people think Putin might consider. But we have to keep in mind, this is not really something new. Putin has been engaging a two-front war since 2022, and maybe even before that. It was a conventional war against Ukraine, but really an unconventional war against the rest of Europe. There was a cyber attack, Russian-based cyber attack on Estonia in 2007. The Estonians chose to take care of it themselves rather than make it a NATO affair, which they could have done. There have been drones shot down over Romania, Russian drones that went into NATO territory, cruise missile drones shot down in Poland as well. So the Russians have been probing already. The Leipzig case that you mentioned is another potential example of that. But I think the idea here now is Putin may be a little desperate, and he does not want to go down in history as the Russian leader who lost Ukraine. And if, the thinking could be if he gets desperate, he might resort to some other types of tactics that one had sort of excluded before.
Daniel, for years, the assumption in Washington was that Putin would avoid direct confrontation with NATO while fighting in Ukraine. Now, if U.S. intelligence, if it's now revising that assessment, what does that tell us about how Putin's mindset may be changing?
Well, as I say, NATO has to be prepared for the full range of possibilities, and it plans for those things all the time. You get intelligence assessments, but the alliance is already, basing its planning on worst case scenarios. So they've been aware of these types of things for some time. But as I say, if Putin feels he's in a corner, he might reach out to different tactics. The most extreme scenario would be a Russian land incursion of military forces across the NATO border. But for NATO, for Putin to do that, he'd have to move forces from where they are now, and NATO would detect that long before anything would happen, unless it would be just an air attack of some kind or something from the sea. So I think that's less likely and would be detected. The sort of little green men scenario where, masked or unidentified for people kind of show up somehow, armed bands. Well, what would that do? That's what Putin did in Ukraine in 2014 in the Donbas region of Ukraine. I think NATO is ready for that again, especially the Baltic states. They said they have a shoot on sight order already. Anybody who shows up like that is just going to be shot. They're not fooling around. They've already told the Russians, if anybody shows up like that, we are just going to assume it's you, and we're not going to, allow you to deny it. And the internal security forces of those states are deeply in contact with NATO forces themselves. So both the domestic security services and the intelligence and the NATO, real military forces are all focused on these contingencies. I think the real intent here would be to do something that divides the alliance. It's not to get some military victory, but to befuddle the political decision makings within NATO and maybe cause some NATO allies to step back from their support either for Ukraine or the alliance itself. That might be more what Putin might intend.
Yeah, intelligence officials, they reportedly are considering scenarios ranging from cyber attacks and sabotage to a limited ground incursion. I mean, is the real danger that Putin finds a way to stay below NATO's threshold for a massive military response?
Yeah, the little green men scenario would be the one, but I think they're prepared for that. The other is, you say, is some type of hybrid below the Article 5, mutual defense clause of NATO scenario. But, Putin's already been probing, as I said. He's already been doing this. Their cyber attacks are nothing new on NATO infrastructure. There are cyber assaults on NATO infrastructures every day, thousands of them from all sorts of groups, including Russian groups. This is a daily happening. The drones and the cruise missiles, they essentially said were targeted for Ukraine and happened to fly over, mistakenly. But I think it's more probing. So Putin's been doing these probes for some time. And if you want to be serious about this, we have to simply understand reality, that Russian related groups have been infiltrating NATO territory for years. They implant cyber malware all through our infrastructure, dams, electrical facilities. It's already there. It's planted. These are ticking time bombs that could go off. You wouldn't even have to cross the border. They could just go off. And we're aware of these things, but I'm not sure the public is quite focused on the fact that these things happen. And it's not just Europe. Last week there were 12 U.S. states targeted their water facilities by and Iranian-linked groups claimed responsibility for that. Iranian groups have tried to blow up U.S. dams in the past. We can readily assume Chinese malware is all through the U.S. system. So, this is the type of security situation Europe faces today. Whether Putin chooses to act, with intent is one thing, but we have to be prepared for any type of scenario.
Daniel, let me ask you, I think probably among the public, when they think of a possible attack, they certainly may think of the worst case scenario, and that is maybe tactical nuclear weapons. That risk, how much do you think it is a part of the calculus in this new assessment?
Well, I didn't see that scenario was part of the intel assessment that you've mentioned. But NATO, plans for all contingencies. If Putin would go nuclear, that would almost certainly provide for a NATO nuclear response, which is not something he wants to do. And I think that would, of course, make the Ukraine thing just part of a larger war, which I don't think Putin is ready for. So I don't think that that's probably likely, although we have to be, prepared for that. The other possibility, though, is that if Putin feels he's backed into a corner, if he feels the Ukraine war is not going so well, that some sort of limited demonstration effect, as the Russians like to say, of a nuclear device could be something that the Ukrainians need to be very concerned about. He's threatened that a number of times. And that part of Russian military doctrine is if you're backed in a corner, you might preemptively use these weapons to sort of tell the adversary, back off. What Russians call a demonstration would be horrific. Of course, it would be unprecedented. Yeah. The Chinese have even been nervous about this. They've told the Russians at least twice not to do it. So there's great pressure on Russia not to do this. But again, Putin is very committed to his assault on Ukraine, and he thinks of his place in history and not going down as the Russian leader that lost Ukraine. So one has to think about these scenarios. There would be huge it would be a disaster for Ukraine, but there'd be spillover, of course, across Europe. And one would have to think about its meaning in terms of nuclear use for global security.
Would you say that the greatest vulnerability facing NATO today, is it military weakness or is it political division?
I think the idea that you can divide the alliance by some sort of limited scenario is the one we should focus on. There's not a military issue there. Russia is not going to challenge NATO militarily. It is far weaker than the combined sum of allied military capability. But Putin knows that not every NATO ally agrees with the threat assessment. There are countries that are somewhat sympathetic to Russia these days that are in the alliance, and so triggering a limited incursion that questions whether NATO solidarity is unified is something we should consider seriously, because I think that's the more likely scenario. That would distract NATO and show divisions at a time when the Ukrainians, need NATO unity to help them. And so I think that's more what we do. A full-out Russian assault elsewhere would, of course, free up Ukraine to then go after the Russians. So, it not necessarily makes sense that the Russians would engage in a second front of a war that they're already kind of losing right now.
Daniel, how much does this assessment reflect concerns about the United States itself? I mean, not Russia getting stronger, but America becoming more distracted, more divided, and potentially less willing to carry the burden of European security. How much of a factor do you think is in this assessment?
Well, the Europeans are very concerned about that, of course. The Trump administration at the Ankara summit at NATO summit just some weeks ago said they're conducting a force posture review of U.S. forces in Europe. That should be done in 6 months. But the clear intent is that Europe should bear the brunt of the conventional defense of Europe, while the U.S. tends to, think elsewhere. because we're so strapped about different contingencies. The question is whether the U.S. nuclear deterrent would hold. I think every reason tells me it would, even if Europeans need to step up on conventional defense. Mm-hmm. But it's the political element again. Will the U.S. actually be there politically for the Europeans and the solidarity of NATO remain? That's, I think, the question in European minds, whether you can count on the United States. In the end, the mutual defense clause of NATO is a matter of trust. It's a basic, you trust each other. Mm-hmm. Because there's nothing automatic about what the allies have said they will do to help each other. Mm-hmm. It really depends on the circumstance. And if you have to really trust each other to really invest, you're committing your entire security to other countries. And so if you think of European history, this is something you take very seriously. So I think the fact the U.S. is maybe seen now as maybe not trustworthy, not an ally, that's a question. On the other hand, if we take the scenarios you just mentioned, the Baltic states, there are up to 2,000 U.S. troops in the Baltic states. There are 10,000 of them in Poland. There's another 1,000 in Romania. Where these scenarios might happen would not just mean an invasion of those countries, it would affect and directly maybe target U.S. military personnel. That's what's called the tripwire. The U.S. is so committed, its own people are in harm's way. And that still is the case. So I would think something that would affect U.S. military personnel directly would, of course, in my view, still engage the U.S. in European security and its defense, even with the current administration.
Daniel Hamilton. Daniel, good having you with us. Excellent analysis, too. There's so much to unpack here. We appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you.
Good to be with you. Thank you so much.
So what do you think? How likely is a Russian attack, be it hybrid, cyber, or conventional, on NATO territory here in Europe? New U.S. intel warns it could happen as early as this fall, as late as 2029. Are we running out of time? Send us your thoughts in the comment section. Join the discussion. And until next time, for all of us here in Berlin, thanks for watching.